When my supervisor told me I couldn't handle pressure after I'd just spent my entire weekend fixing his $300,000 mistake, I knew exactly what Monday's meeting would bring. I'd been preparing for this moment for longer than he realized. The irony wasn't lost on me. There I sat in his office that Friday afternoon, listening to him explain how the department needed someone with stronger leadership capabilities, someone who could handle high-pressure situations without cracking. The termination papers were already printed, sitting in a neat manila folder on his desk. Everything about the conversation felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced this speech in the mirror that morning. What he didn't know was that I'd discovered his procurement error 3 days earlier. $300,000 in mislabeled equipment orders, all traced back to specifications he'd personally approved without consulting our technical team. The kind of mistake that ends careers and triggers federal compliance investigations in our industry. I'd been with the company for 8 years, working my way up from junior analyst to senior systems coordinator. My background in supply chain logistics and federal contracting regulations made me one of the few people in the building who could actually read those procurement documents. That expertise had saved the company millions over the years, quietly fixing problems before they became crises, preventing cost overruns that would have made headlines. But expertise doesn't photograph well in corporate presentations. It doesn't generate impressive quarterly metrics or fill PowerPoint slides with colorful charts. It just works, day after day, year after year, until the day it's no longer there. My supervisor had been hired 18 months earlier, brought in from outside the industry with promises of modernization and efficiency improvements. His background was in general management, heavy on theoretical frameworks and light on practical application. The kind of executive who used phrases like synergistic optimization and streamlined operational matrices without understanding what those words actually meant in our specific context. He'd spent his first year restructuring departments and implementing new reporting systems that generated impressive documentation while making our actual work significantly more complicated. Every process that had been streamlined through years of practical experience got wrapped in additional layers of approval and oversight. We were documenting our documentation, reporting on our reports, and holding meetings to schedule meetings about meetings. The procurement error was entirely predictable. He'd bypassed our established review process, the one that had been developed specifically to catch these kinds of specification mismatches. Instead, he'd implemented a new fast-track approval system that looked efficient on paper, but eliminated the technical validation steps that prevented exactly this kind of mistake. When I discovered the error, my first instinct was to bring it directly to his attention. After all, mistakes happen, and the sooner we addressed it, the easier it would be to correct. The vendor hadn't shipped yet, and we could still modify the order without significant financial impact. That's when I learned about the timing. The shipment was scheduled for Monday morning, with installation beginning immediately. The mistake had been sitting in the system for 3 weeks, working its way through various approval stages while nobody with actual technical knowledge had eyes on it. By the time it reached my desk for final logistics coordination, we had exactly 1 weekend to prevent a catastrophe. I spent Thursday night and most of Friday morning trying to reach him through official channels. His assistant informed me he was in back-to-back meetings all day, preparing for some strategic planning session with the executive team. The urgency forms I submitted disappeared into his inbox without response. The escalation protocols he'd established for situations like this required his direct approval to activate, creating a bureaucratic loop that couldn't be resolved without his participation. So I was already running on no sleep and high stress when I walked into his office that Friday afternoon, thinking I was there to brief him on the crisis and coordinate our response. Instead, I found myself on the receiving end of a termination speech that had obviously been planned weeks in advance. The conversation was surreal. He sat there explaining how the department needed fresh leadership, how my approach to problem solving was too reactive, too focused on technical details rather than big-picture strategic thinking. Meanwhile, his $300,000 mistake was literally sitting in my laptop bag, documented and ready for immediate correction if he'd just given me 30 seconds to explain the situation. But he didn't want to hear about technical problems. He wanted to talk about leadership potential and adaptability to change. He mentioned how I'd seemed resistant to his new processes, how I'd raised concerns about efficiency metrics that he felt showed a lack of commitment to continuous improvement. The irony was overwhelming, but I kept my expression neutral and my responses professional. He offered me a choice: resign voluntarily with a positive reference, or be terminated for cause with a documentation trail that would make future employment challenging. The subtext was clear. He'd already constructed a narrative that painted me as an obstacle to progress, someone who couldn't adapt to modern management approaches. I chose resignation, not because I was intimidated, but because I understood the larger game being played here. A termination for cause would require documentation and review processes that would inevitably expose the procurement error he still didn't know existed. A voluntary resignation would let him avoid that scrutiny while giving me the flexibility to respond on my own terms. As I cleaned out my desk that afternoon, I could feel the weight of the situation settling around me. My colleagues were confused by the sudden departure, asking questions I couldn't answer directly without creating more problems for everyone involved. The work I'd been doing didn't just disappear because I was no longer officially responsible for it. The procurement error was still there, still scheduled to explode on Monday morning, still carrying the potential to damage relationships with federal contractors and trigger compliance investigations that could affect everyone's employment. I had a choice to make. I could walk away, let the situation unfold naturally, and watch from a distance as the consequences revealed themselves. Or I could spend my weekend fixing a problem that was no longer officially my responsibility, protecting colleagues who hadn't been part of the decision to terminate me, and potentially saving my former supervisor from a career-ending mistake. The ethical calculation was complex. I no longer owed the company anything in terms of official duties or loyalty. They'd made their position clear regarding my value to the organization, but I had relationships with people throughout the company, colleagues who'd be affected by the fallout from this error, regardless of who was officially responsible for it. More importantly, I had professional standards that didn't change based on employment status. The work I did reflected my expertise and integrity, not just my job description. Walking away from a problem I could solve felt like a violation of everything I'd built my career on, even if solving it might ultimately benefit someone who'd just terminated me. I spent Friday evening reviewing the procurement documents in detail, mapping out exactly what had gone wrong, and developing a comprehensive correction strategy. The error was actually worse than I'd initially thought. It wasn't just a specification mismatch, it was a cascading series of mismatches that would create compatibility issues throughout our entire system architecture. The vendor had provided exactly what was ordered, but what was ordered was fundamentally incompatible with our existing infrastructure. Installing this equipment would require additional modifications that weren't budgeted for, couldn't be completed within our project timeline, and would potentially void warranties on other system components. But the real problem was regulatory compliance. Our industry operates under strict federal oversight, with equipment specifications tied to safety certifications and operational permits. Installing non-compliant equipment wouldn't just be expensive to fix. It would trigger mandatory reporting requirements and potential suspension of our operating licenses. This wasn't just a procurement error. It was a compliance violation that could shut down operations while federal inspectors reviewed our entire system architecture. The financial impact wouldn't be limited to the cost of replacing the equipment. It would include operational downtime, regulatory penalties, and potential legal exposure that could reach into the millions. Saturday morning, I started making calls, not to my former supervisor or anyone in the corporate hierarchy, but directly to the vendor's weekend support team. I'd worked with this company for years, building relationships that went beyond simple transactional interactions. They knew my voice, trusted my technical expertise, and understood the urgency when I explained the situation. The vendor's weekend manager was sympathetic but realistic about the constraints. The equipment was already staged for shipping, with delivery trucks scheduled for Monday morning pickup. Modifying the order at this point would require approval from their manufacturing team, coordination with their logistics partners, and potentially custom configuration work that normally required weeks of lead time. But they also understood the compliance implications. A regulatory violation wouldn't just affect our company, it would create problems for their business relationship with federal contractors and potentially impact their own certification status. They had as much incentive to fix this situation as we did, assuming someone was willing to coordinate the solution. I spent Saturday afternoon working through the technical specifications, identifying exactly what needed to be changed, and developing alternative configurations that would meet our compliance requirements. This wasn't just about canceling the wrong order, it was about creating a new order that would work within our system architecture while maintaining all necessary certifications and approvals. The complexity was significant. Every component had to be verified against federal specifications, cross-referenced with our existing infrastructure, and validated for compatibility with our operational requirements. The documentation alone required dozens of forms, each with specific technical details that had to be perfectly accurate to avoid additional compliance issues. By Saturday evening, I had a complete solution package ready for implementation. New specifications, updated compliance documentation, revised installation timeline, and cost analysis showing how the corrected order would actually save money compared to the original error. The vendor was standing by to process the changes, pending approval from someone with purchasing authority. Sunday morning brought a new challenge. The purchasing department operated on automated systems that required specific authorization codes to modify orders above certain dollar thresholds. Those codes were restricted to senior management, including the supervisor who'd terminated me and was presumably enjoying his weekend without any awareness of the crisis brewing for Monday morning. I could have tried reaching him directly, explaining the situation and requesting emergency authorization to process the changes. But our relationship had been definitively established the previous afternoon, and I wasn't optimistic about his receptiveness to weekend calls from someone he'd just fired. Instead, I focused on documentation. If I couldn't prevent the crisis, I could at least ensure that the solution was immediately available when the crisis became apparent. I prepared comprehensive briefing materials that would allow anyone with purchasing authority to understand the problem and implement the fix within hours rather than weeks. The documentation package included everything: technical analysis of the original error, compliance risk assessment, vendor coordination agreements, revised specifications, cost comparisons, implementation timeline, and step-by-step instructions for processing the corrected order. Someone with minimal technical background could follow this roadmap and resolve the entire situation in a matter of hours. Sunday afternoon, I made one final attempt to reach someone in management through official channels. I called the emergency contact number that was supposed to connect to whoever was on call for critical issues. The answering service took my information and promised to relay the message, but I never received a callback. By Sunday evening, I'd done everything possible to prevent or minimize the impact of Monday morning's crisis. The solution was ready, the vendor was prepared to act, and the documentation was comprehensive enough to guide anyone through the implementation process. All that remained was waiting to see how the situation would unfold. Monday morning arrived with predictable chaos. I wasn't there to witness it directly, but I had friends throughout the company who kept me informed about the developing situation. The equipment arrived on schedule, the installation team took one look at the specifications, and everything ground to a halt while they tried to understand how someone had ordered components that were fundamentally incompatible with our system architecture. The first call came around 10 o'clock from the procurement manager who'd been pulled into an emergency meeting to explain how this had happened. She was the one who'd always handled the technical review process that had been bypassed in this case, and she was understandably confused about how such an obvious error had made it through the system. The second call came from the compliance officer who'd been contacted by the installation team about potential regulatory violations. He was reviewing the equipment specifications and trying to understand the implications for our operating permits and federal certifications. The third call came from the vendor's account manager, who was trying to coordinate with someone who had authority to modify the order. They'd held the shipment pending resolution, but they needed official approval to proceed with the changes I'd arranged the previous weekend. By noon, my former supervisor was apparently in full crisis management mode, trying to understand how this had happened and coordinate a response that would minimize the impact on Monday's planned installation. Multiple meetings were scheduled, various experts were being consulted, and everyone was scrambling to develop a solution for a problem that I'd already solved the previous weekend. The irony was becoming overwhelming. Here was someone who'd just terminated me for allegedly being unable to handle pressure, now facing a high-pressure crisis that I'd not only anticipated, but had already resolved. The same technical expertise he'd dismissed as overly detailed and reactive was exactly what was needed to understand and fix the situation he'd unknowingly created. Around 2 o'clock, the procurement manager called me directly. She'd been asked to lead the response team, and she was familiar with my work on similar issues. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to consult on the solution, potentially as a contractor, to help minimize the damage from this procurement error. I told her I'd already been working on it, over the weekend in fact, and I had a complete solution ready for immediate implementation, including vendor coordination, revised specifications, and all necessary documentation. If she had 20 minutes, I could walk her through the entire package and have the crisis resolved by the end of the day. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. She'd been expecting to spend weeks developing a response to this crisis, coordinating with various departments and vendors, navigating regulatory requirements and compliance procedures. Instead, she was hearing that the solution had been sitting ready since Sunday afternoon, developed by someone who'd been terminated less than 4 days earlier. I spent the next hour walking her through the documentation package, explaining the technical details and implementation steps. She was impressed by the thoroughness of the analysis and the practical approach to solving not just the immediate problem, but the underlying process issues that had allowed it to occur. By 4 o'clock Monday afternoon, she'd presented the solution to the crisis response team and received approval to implement the changes. The vendor processed the revised order, the installation was rescheduled for later in the week, and the compliance documentation was updated to reflect the corrected specifications. Tuesday morning brought a call from the Human Resources Director asking if I'd be available to meet with senior management about a consulting arrangement. Apparently, the resolution of Monday's crisis had raised some questions about the circumstances surrounding my departure and the company's need for the specific expertise I'd demonstrated. The meeting was scheduled for Wednesday afternoon, in the same conference room where I'd attended countless project reviews and strategic planning sessions over the previous 8 years. The attendees included the Human Resources Director, the Procurement Manager, the Compliance Officer, and my former supervisor. The atmosphere was professionally awkward. Everyone understood that we were there to discuss bringing back someone who'd been terminated less than a week earlier, under circumstances that now looked significantly different in light of recent events. The weekend's crisis had highlighted both the value of the expertise that had been dismissed and the consequences of the management decisions that had led to the problem. The Human Resources Director opened the discussion by reviewing the events of the previous week, from my termination on Friday through the crisis resolution on Monday. She noted that the technical expertise I'd demonstrated in solving the procurement error was exactly the kind of problem-solving capability the company needed to prevent similar issues in the future. The procurement manager provided a detailed analysis of how the weekend solution had not only resolved the immediate crisis, but had also identified process improvements that would prevent similar errors from occurring. She recommended implementing my suggested changes to the approval workflow, which would restore technical review steps while maintaining the efficiency improvements that had been the goal of the original restructuring. The compliance officer discussed the regulatory implications of the near miss, noting that the potential violations could have resulted in operational shutdowns and federal investigations that would have affected everyone's employment. He emphasized that the quick resolution had been possible only because of the comprehensive documentation and vendor coordination that had been prepared in advance. My former supervisor sat quietly through most of the discussion, occasionally asking questions about technical details or implementation timelines. His demeanor was notably different from the previous Friday's termination meeting. The confident authority he'd displayed then had been replaced by a more subdued professionalism that suggested he understood the implications of what had transpired. When the discussion turned to my potential return to the company, he spoke directly about the situation. He acknowledged that the termination decision had been based on incomplete information about the value of my contributions to the organization. He recognized that the expertise he'd characterized as overly detailed and reactive had proven essential for preventing significant operational and regulatory problems. The conversation was careful and professional, focusing on practical considerations rather than personal dynamics. Nobody wanted to rehash the details of Friday's termination or assign blame for the procurement error. The focus was on moving forward in a way that would benefit the organization while addressing the legitimate concerns that had led to the original decision. The Human Resources Director proposed a modified arrangement that would address both the company's need for my expertise and the management structure concerns that had precipitated my termination. I would return as a senior technical consultant, reporting directly to the procurement manager rather than to my former supervisor. This would maintain clear management accountability while ensuring that technical expertise was properly integrated into decision-making processes. The compensation package included not only restoration of my previous salary and benefits, but also recognition of the weekend's crisis resolution work. The consulting fee for preventing the procurement disaster was significant enough to demonstrate that the company understood the value of the expertise they'd nearly lost. More importantly, the new position would include formal authority to review and approve technical specifications for all major procurement decisions. This wasn't just about restoring my employment, it was about institutionalizing the technical review process that had been bypassed in this case. The new role would ensure that similar errors couldn't occur without appropriate technical oversight. The meeting concluded with an agreement to proceed with the new arrangement, effective immediately. I would return to work on Thursday morning, not as the employee who'd been terminated the previous Friday, but as a senior consultant with enhanced authority and recognition for the expertise that had just proven essential to the organization's operations. Thursday morning felt surreal as I walked back into the building where I'd worked for 8 years, been terminated 4 days earlier, and now held a position with more authority and recognition than I'd ever had before. Colleagues who'd been confused by my sudden departure were now equally confused by my equally sudden return. But the explanation was straightforward. The company had discovered they needed the expertise they'd just eliminated. My former supervisor and I had a brief professional conversation about the transition. He acknowledged that the events of the previous week had demonstrated the value of technical expertise in preventing operational problems. He expressed appreciation for my willingness to return and work collaboratively to prevent similar issues in the future. There was no dramatic confrontation, no moment of vindictive triumph, no public humiliation or revenge. Just a quiet recognition that expertise has value that isn't always apparent until it's absent. The pressure I'd supposedly been unable to handle had been precisely the kind of pressure that my technical background and experience had prepared me to manage. The real vindication wasn't in his acknowledgement of the mistake or in the enhanced position I'd been offered. It was in the demonstration that technical expertise and careful preparation could prevent crises that would otherwise damage everyone involved. The weekend I'd spent fixing his error had protected not just my professional reputation, but the livelihoods of everyone in the organization who would have been affected by a regulatory shutdown. Over the weeks that followed, the new technical review process prevented several other potential procurement errors, each one smaller than the weekend's crisis, but collectively significant in their impact on operational efficiency and regulatory compliance. The changes I'd recommended were implemented systematically, creating a robust framework that balanced efficiency goals with technical accuracy. My former supervisor adapted well to the new structure, focusing on the strategic and administrative aspects of management while deferring to technical expertise for specialized decisions. The relationship was professional and collaborative, based on mutual recognition of different areas of strength rather than competition for authority. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone involved. Someone who'd been terminated for allegedly being unable to handle pressure had demonstrated exactly the kind of pressure management that the organization needed during actual crises. The same attention to technical detail that had been characterized as excessive had proven essential for preventing regulatory violations and operational disruptions. But the broader lesson was about the value of expertise in organizational decision-making. Technical knowledge isn't just about solving problems after they occur, it's about recognizing and preventing problems before they become crises. The weekend's crisis resolution had been possible only because years of experience had prepared me to understand the implications of seemingly minor specification errors. The company learned that eliminating technical expertise in the name of efficiency could create vulnerabilities that far outweighed any administrative savings. The cost of maintaining technical review processes was minimal compared to the potential cost of the errors those processes prevented. The weekend's near miss had been an expensive lesson in the value of specialized knowledge. 6 months later, the procurement department had become a model for other divisions, demonstrating how technical expertise could be integrated into streamlined processes without sacrificing efficiency. The changes I'd recommended had been expanded throughout the organization, creating a systematic approach to technical review that prevented errors while maintaining operational speed. My role had evolved beyond procurement consultation to include broader technical advisory responsibilities. I was regularly consulted on decisions involving regulatory compliance, system architecture, and operational risk management. The expertise that had once been relegated to narrow technical functions was now recognized as essential for strategic decision-making. The relationship with my former supervisor had settled into professional collaboration based on complementary skills rather than hierarchical authority. He handled the administrative and strategic aspects of management while I provided technical expertise and operational insight. The arrangement worked well for both of us and, more importantly, for the organization as a whole. Looking back on that surreal week in March, I'm struck by how quickly circumstances can change when expertise is properly valued and appropriately applied. The termination that had seemed like a career setback became an opportunity to demonstrate value that hadn't been fully appreciated in the normal course of daily work. The crisis that could have damaged everyone's career instead became a catalyst for process improvements that benefited the entire organization. The weekend I'd spent fixing someone else's mistake became the foundation for enhanced authority and recognition that exceeded anything I'd achieved in 8 years of normal employment. But the real satisfaction wasn't in the professional vindication or the enhanced position. It was in the knowledge that technical expertise, carefully applied and thoroughly documented, could prevent crises that would otherwise damage people and organizations. The pressure I'd been accused of being unable to handle was exactly the kind of pressure that my background and experience had prepared me to manage effectively. The lesson I took from the experience was about the importance of maintaining professional standards regardless of employment circumstances. The work I did that weekend reflected my expertise and integrity, not my job description or official responsibilities. Walking away from a problem I could solve would have violated everything I'd built my career on, even if solving it ultimately benefited someone who'd just terminated me. The ethical calculation had been complex, balancing personal interests against professional obligations and the potential impact on colleagues who weren't responsible for the management decisions that had created the crisis. In the end, the choice to spend my weekend fixing the problem was based on professional standards that didn't change based on employment status. The outcome validated that approach. Technical expertise applied with integrity and thoroughness created value that was ultimately recognized and rewarded. The crisis that could have ended multiple careers instead became an opportunity to demonstrate the importance of specialized knowledge in organizational decision-making. Today, when I train new employees on technical procedures and compliance requirements, I emphasize the importance of maintaining professional standards regardless of circumstances. Technical expertise isn't just about knowing how to solve problems, it's about understanding when and why to apply that knowledge for the benefit of everyone involved. The weekend that changed everything taught me that true expertise isn't just about technical knowledge, it's about the judgment to apply that knowledge appropriately, even when the circumstances are challenging and the beneficiaries are ungrateful. The pressure I'd supposedly been unable to handle was precisely the kind of pressure that technical expertise is meant to manage. And sometimes the best way to handle pressure is to work through it quietly, thoroughly, and professionally, letting the results speak for themselves rather than trying to explain your value to people who don't understand it. The Monday meeting that left my former supervisor speechless wasn't about dramatic confrontation or vindictive triumph. It was about the quiet power of expertise properly applied. That's the kind of pressure I've always been able to handle.